Hi, you're listening to Marcia Pally and conversations I'm having with people about the criteria we should use to design and implement our economic and political policies. What should be our basic framework for determining public policy? These conversations are based on ideas from a book of mine, Commonwealth and Covenant, Economics, Politics, and Theologies of Relationality, because we're looking specifically at relationality as this framework for policy. Relationality includes both the individual person and the relations and contexts that he or she is in. Relationality is developed in many of our philosophical traditions and also in several theological traditions. Whether you think theologies are the word of the divine or an illuminating metaphor, in both cases they offer us much about how the world and people work, and so about the policies that will lead to the greatest human flourishing. Please join us in this series of conversations. Commonwealth and Covenant was published by Erdman's Press in 2016. You can follow me at marciapally.com or search for me on Facebook and Twitter. So we're going to start today with some of the thoughts that came up at the end of our discussion of Trinity last week. And one of them is actually discussed at the end of the chapter on Trinity. And that's the question of ecclesiology. What is the effect of Trinitarian thinking on the church? And Heike, I think you wanted to start with that.
It's essential for a church that says our members are every single one related to God, to each other, and to the world. And I'm kind of very suspicious about the realization of this idea. And you said something at the end of the chapter about the grassroots participation and anti-authoritarianism that should play a role in churches too. And on the other side, there's Lutheran traditions that are totally different. They are very hierarchical. And I don't know in how far an institution can realize these grassroots.
You know, I think you actually raise up 2 points. One is the question of how do we foster the Trinitarian-like or perichoresis-like approach to each other, to people within our communities, among communities, and so on. And the other one is a much more ecclesiological question, as you yourself said. We have churches or institutions, they have hierarchies, and it was the person whose comment that you picked up for exactly on this, the realism of this point, is Colin Gunton, who is from the UK, and he noticed from his UK perspective the more perichoretic nature of the ecclesiology of the United States landscape, where there's much less hierarchy. But on a day-to-day basis, as we say, under the radar, individual churches make their own decisions about practice and liturgy and all kinds of issues. So we have two. We have one, the kind of more general, how do we foster a feeling of reciprocal responsibility or care, and the other one is a real pragmatic ecclesiology question. And how realistic is it?
I'm not sure if it's the theological idea of reciprocity, or if it's the situation in the United States with church policy, the way it works. I don't really know. Is it theologically reflected to have low hierarchy levels?
How do we foster the perichoresis approach? I don't know exactly how we can foster it, but I also actually noticed the concept and I really like that. And I think, for example, that because, for example, I wrote something down. There's a sentence, actually it's a quotation already in the book, and it was perichoresis proposes that we can give our service as a gift of love to our neighbors without end and without loss. And this concept of that we can give something or give our service, give love to somebody else without a loss, I think it can be used somehow. But I don't think it's a very difficult concept to understand.
Last time Julia actually raised this point and about the problem of boundaries and giving. And last time we discussed that we should remember that the notion of giving without loss is reciprocal. And this helps deal with the question essentially of abuse, that you give and you give and you give and you are not giving back to. Mm-hmm. But if you take the perichoresis idea that it is reciprocal, everybody has obligations to you in the way you have obligations to them. So this I think makes it even easier to understand, because people then don't have to fear that they're going to be taken advantage of, because the obligations and the entire approach would not be just your approach, but would be the way everybody does things. That's just the way we do it around here. Yeah? The reason why the church structures, plural, are different in the United States from the way they are in, let's say, Europe, where most of these churches came from originally, is because churches interact with everything else in their environments. And this is how we know that we observe that church practices change from century to century, from country to country, because they're in a kind of dynamic interaction with everything else going on in society. This doesn't mean that God changes or that the liturgy changes or that the core values change, but we know from observing history that churches in different points in time and in different places do different things. And the churches in the United States came into a certain historical conditions starting in the 17th century of multi-faithed immigration into what they thought was a wilderness. It wasn't. There were many American Indians living there, but they thought it was a wilderness. So they thought of it as a kind of blank. And they were left largely to their own initiative and ability to survive. Therefore, they were very appreciative of immigration, and immigration came from many different faiths. I'm talking about the 17th century, the 18th century. So the facts on the ground were of a multi-faithed landscape from the start. And although there were tensions between the faiths, they also had to find a way to work it out for survival reasons. And another element in the immigration was the anti-authoritarian worldview and priority that many of the immigrants came with. Often they were persecuted by the dominant churches in Europe, so they emphatically did not want to set up another authority that could persecute. And even in the beginning, when in the 17th century, certain denominations like the Congregationalists set up virtually a theocracy in Massachusetts Bay and in Connecticut, there were immediate pressures to find a way to work in with multi-faithed immigration. It took a while, but it was the course of events for very basic reasons. So there's an anti-authoritarianism that is built in for a number of reasons. The dissenters' suspicion of authority. Many of the immigrants from England were already fleeing the centralization efforts of Charles I in the early decades of immigration. There was a very strong anti-authoritarian perspective from the beginning, and that is reinforced by multi-faith immigration. And so the landscape was different, and the churches developed differently. Now, it's not a case of better or worse, it's different historical situations. I think this is what some people from Europe, like Colin Gunton in this case, notice about the relatively flat hierarchies. This is a 400-year historical process in the United States. And it leads to certain advantages, certain disadvantages, like everything else in culture. And there are churches that are much more hierarchical than others, which are emphatically flat. And a lot of the emergent churches see their organization as essentially anti-authoritarian and a flat hierarchy where everybody contributes.
What you said is, you explained the historical path.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't know if it's theologically reflected, and if it is possible to implant or to pose these ideas that are, a basic theological idea into today church structures. I don't know. And well, probably there is no answer to it. And at times it works, and other times it doesn't. Maybe it has to do with my everyday life and church structures I struggle with, so to say. Theologically, people say, yeah, we are the same, but it doesn't work. And I don't know if it can work.
Yeah.
I don't know. But we don't have to discuss it because it's,
Well, it's an important, how do you make it work, or how much do you make it work, right? So working is not an on-off switch. In practice, I think this is the idea not to rigidify hierarchical structures is a struggle that I think churches have. And even when there's a recognizable hierarchy, there's a pastor, or there's a priest, or there's an imam, right? There is a recognizable hierarchy. How to prevent it from rigidifying, from blocking out the voices of people who are not in the hierarchy? Not everybody wants to be a priest or an imam or a rabbi, but how do you include voices of people who are not in these positions? And I think that's a living, in my experience, that's a living process, and people fail and succeed in different measures. Does somebody have a different experience of that?
And those that work, I think, are what I know is, for example, some democratic schools that have been working for many, many decades, where people are incredibly committed to work on themselves all the time. And I think that's the price. As soon as you have people involved that cannot or will not or are not interested in this process, engaging in a process of self-questioning, you lose the temptation of authority will be there and will be grasped and will be, I mean, it's governments, it's schools, it's churches, it's always the problem of how much people are actually engaged in wanting to engage in a change process and reflecting, which always entails an admittance of a certain degree of humility and admittance of character failings, of questioning oneself and admitting that the others might be right, which is very difficult in human dealing. So I think it's
just what you said made me remind me of one thing. That when you said democracy, there are direct democracies and there are representative democracies where you can't do everything yourself. You don't have the time. It's unreasonable. You elect people. The way you bring a pastor into your community. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
No.
But I think the question about how do we prevent that from excluding the other voices who have interests in the community, even if we have a, quote, representative but not a direct democracy?
For example, the solution is not to be completely free, because the lack of boundaries is they lose themselves. So there's
I don't think you were recommending chaos or lack of discipline or boundaries or rules. I don't think that was your question as I understood it.
No, not at all.
No, but I refer to the necessity of a leader, and then the question is, the leader is always the problem. When somebody is in charge, how are they in charge? Do they have real authority in the sense of really engaging and owning this authority, which is a problem, for example, in a lot of, I work in the field of schools where there's a lot of women leading kindergarten where they have a problem with authority, which makes, when somebody who's in an authority position doesn't claim their authority, chaos follows. So it's always this, I mean, we're back at what is authority and how am I going to be a good leader, which is also a political question, but it's also in kindergarten and it's in families. How am I a good leader?
We can talk about responsibility, or we can talk about hierarchy. That's different. Responsibility doesn't have to be a hierarchy thing.
I keep wanting to throw in, especially as you're talking about right-wing movers and so on, that in our thinking about it, what I think is hard to keep in, there are certain things that are easy to keep on the screen and things that are harder to keep on the screen. And I think the reciprocity aspect is harder to keep on the screen. If you have a structure that has leaders, it has leaders because it's a reasonable way to organize. And as I said, not everybody wants to be a rabbi, a pastor, an imam, and so on. But if there's reciprocity in those relationships between the representative and other voices who want to contribute. And I think that's the struggle, not leaderlessness or boundarylessness, but how do we maintain the reciprocity, even if you have leaders?